Good evening, everyone. We are embarking on a two-session study in Exodus chapter 12 in conjunction with the oncoming Passover feast. Now, many a times we tend to look at the Passover by just generally reading the English text. Today, I would like to propose that we would spend some time to look at the underlying Hebrew to actually get the nuances and what the English doesn't actually express. Because there are lots of things that we can actually learn, and we can actually see why this chapter is so important and this particular feast is important as well. And so let us begin, and we will split this into verse 1 to 28 today, and then we'll continue tomorrow with the rest of the chapter. Now, this chapter is broken into two portions in these first 28 verses. First, we have God speaking to Moses and Aaron. Then we have Moses and Aaron speaking to the congregation. Now, this is very important for us to know because sometimes you find that why are things repeated? And so we are beginning with section A, and then we will go into section B, and then we will end in verse 28. So bear that in mind. So let us begin. And now, and this would be the word, and then after chapter 11, then Jehovah, this is God himself, had a very specific instruction given to Moshe and Aharon. Now remember, Moses is the key person that God wants him to represent God to Pharaoh. And so earlier on in the book of Exodus, God made Moses an Elohim to Pharaoh. And then Moses has Aaron. Aaron became the prophet, the Navi, and Moses became the Elohim. And so you need to always understand that these two goes hand in hand. And Moses will speak to Aaron, and then Aaron will speak to Pharaoh. That's how that relationship goes. But at this point in time, in chapter 12, God spoke to Moshe, Moses, and Aaron, and they are still in the land of Mizraim. Egypt is known by the ancient name Mitzrayim, right? Mitzrayim. In verse 2, we continue. It says, "This month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year for you." Now, oftentimes when we do studies like this, you find that statements are broken into two parts. Now, the two parts that we can see, um, it will be, in this case, one part here, that would be an A, and this part here would be a B, and both phrases or both statements are actually emphasizing on the same thing. So this month, and we don't know the name for this month, but after they went to Babylon, this particular month is known as Nisan. This is a Babylonian name. The actual first month of the year normally is in the month of Tishrei. Let me put it here. And Tishrei, at this point in time, is the seventh month. And Nisan is now called the first month. These names of the month came from the Babylonian era. And so what we have now, as we can see, is that it's only depicted by the number. It is the first month of the year, the beginning of months. What do you mean by the beginning of month? This will be the head of months. If you have 12 months, you call this the head of the month. It is to be the first month of the Shana, of the year, which is 12 months. And so you will find that all of this is very important to emphasize that this is a new year. So in a Jewish term, this is one of the Rosh Hashanah. This is like a new year. In the seventh month, they will have another Rosh Hashanah. So there are a couple of New Year's kind of concept in the Jewish mind. But for our purposes today, verse 2 really tells the Israelite that this month, and this is the spring month. And later on, we would see spring is Aviv, the springtime month. And this is the best month of the year. And this is the period where the constellation of Aries comes up. Now, whatever it is, we want to just bear in mind that this is a religious ritual that is given as an instruction to the children of Israel. So this month has always going to be a remembrance. Why? Because every time you start a new year, we always remember it as a significant date. And so God wants the people to remember this month as a significant date. And once you have it in the calendar, then the children of Israel will always remember this month and the significance of this month as God describes it. So in verse 3 tells us, speak to all the congregation of Israel. Remember, right now we are here. God speaking to Moses and Aaron, and they are going to speak to the congregation later. He says, on the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb for themselves according to the father's households, a lamb for each household. Now, the English seems easy enough, but just bear in mind that how do you know there is a 10th of this month? Remember, a month is a lunar cycle. The lunar cycle starts with the sliver of the moon, always barely seen. And then it goes to a full moon, right? To a full moon, and then to no moon. And the moon disappears at the end of the lunar cycle. And that's called the month or the moon. So on the 10th means that you have to count 10 times that cycle of days. The cycle of days would be from the time the new moon is spotted, and then there is evening, there is morning, and they call it one day. And that's what it means. So they count 10 times of the day, and that would be 10 days. How do you know that it is the beginning? When you get the sighting of the moon after the moon had disappeared. And so in this particular month, when it starts, they are instructed, each one. Then it says here to take a lamb. Take a lamb means to take hold of a lamb in verse 3. Now, what does that mean? On the 10th of the month, they are to take hold of a lamb according to each household. So this is the word that we need to pay attention to. This word lamb is actually uh, the word se, right? And the word se doesn't mean lamb. There is no English equivalent for the word se. But what it actually depicts would be one from the flock. Now, what flock do they take care of? These would be the sheep flock and the goat flock. Those little animals that come together in one. And so, if you have a chance to go to Israel and the Middle East, when they have a flock, they are a mixture of sheep and goat. And that's how they would take care of all this. And this word is se. And so se is the actual word, and it's not lamb. The lamb is actually a misnomer, I would say a wrong term to use, but since there is no singular word, it has been popularly translated as lamb. And so for our purposes today, to know the Hebrew, the word lamb does not equate to the word se. That is what I'm trying to point out right now. And so remember this word se. And when it comes to lamb, in actual fact, there is a word for lamb, and it's not se. Now let's carry on to verse 4. Verse 4 says, and now if the household is too small for a se, for lack of a better word, right? A se. Then he and his neighbor nearest to his house are to take one se, according to the number of persons in them, to apportion them to what one should eat, and you are to divide the lamb. This is to make sure that things are not gone to waste, because an animal's life is involved. And so here is a principle of apportionment to recognize that a small household cannot eat the whole animal. They are to share with their neighbors. But more importantly now comes to verse 5. Verse 5 says, your se, right? Your se shall be unblemished, male, within a year old. And you may take it from the sheep or the goats. And this is important now. Why is it important? Is because this is the rule. This is the requirement that God is giving to Moses and Aaron. Your se shall be an unblemished lamb. Unblemished means perfect. I think it will also mean complete, right? Complete. Now, how do you see a complete animal? A complete animal is one that has no impairment. No impairment. And what does that mean? It means that when you look at the animal, you can actually inspect the animal, that it is not crippled, it doesn't have one eye blind, it is not striped, or it doesn't carry blemishes. I think unblemished, no blemishes. It is not there are no scars on the body. It is like perfect. Now, the idea of the unblemished has always been required by God. And later on, when you go and read the book of Leviticus in terms of sacrifices, and also in Malachi chapter 1, what does God want? starting from chapter 12, you find that God always wants an unblemished animal because that's the best of the animals that you have. And so that would mean that you are paying attention to the importance of God to give the best of what you have. And so that's the idea of an animal that is perfect. So basically, in Malachi chapter 1, it is contended that even when you go and see the governor, you don't bring a crippled animal, you bring a perfect animal. And so when you come to God, why do you bring a crippled animal? So that would be a good reminder when we talk about an unblemished animal. And the gender is a male, not a female. So can the Israelites decide that, well, I don't have a male, can I just swap it for a female? And the answer is no. And from here, let me give you a clear rule. God's Passover or Pesach, God's rules. There is no room for the Israelites to decide that I think I could use a female animal this year. And you can't do that. Why? Because it is God's Pesach. And then the age is within a year. So this one is within 12 months. So there is a stipulation of age. And what kind of animal would the seh be? Remember, I said that when they have a flock, they usually come from two types of animals. And so this would be a sheep, but this would be a wrong name to use. It's not a sheep, basically. You can call this a young ram because a male sheep is a ram, right? A male sheep is a ram. A baby sheep is a lamb, but in verse 5, it is a male, not just any generic gender. The second one is goat. Now, goat has, well, I guess goat has a kid, right? That would be a baby goat. And so both of these are acceptable to God, not a female, not older, and definitely not a cow or a bull. So it's very specific. Nobody should be having the free will to change this. And then the instruction is to keep. Now, understand this word. In verse 6, though it says, keep it until the 14th day of the same month, this word keep is a very important word, which is not translated properly. This is the word. This word means a guard post. To guard it, to watch it. So the translation is to keep it, but that's not exactly the word. A guard post. And basically what they're trying to do is you need to actually tie it to the bedpost and watch it. Why is this so important? So the idea of keep is to make sure the animal that they picked on the 10th day is the same animal that is on the 14th day, that is not run away and got mingled with the crowd, and that it doesn't go and hurt itself. It has to be by the 14th day, still the same perfect animal, male from the sheep or the goat family within a year. And so basically their instruction is from the 10th to the 14th, make sure that you know how to keep it safe to ensure that it's the same animal. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel will slaughter it. Now, in verse 6, the idea of slaughter basically is to kill, right? To kill it at twilight, and this twilight would be towards sunset. Now, always remember, whenever we talk about sunset, the Jewish day begins from sunset to sunset. And so when their day begins, they will be cooking and they will be preparing for a meal. And so it has to be slaughtered before the end of the day. Sometime here, right? Sometime here. X marks the spot. Moreover, they shall take some of the blood and put it onto two doorposts and the lintel of the houses which they eat it. This would mean that you are to put the blood on the door. And what that means is it would be on the side and on the top. And now I would like to take a detour to Exodus chapter 8 so that we know why is this so significant. Why is this ritual so significant? And thereby we will have a clearer picture why the sheep family or the goat family is involved and not something else. We take a look at Exodus 8 verse 25, where there was a plague of flies, and Pharaoh was very disturbed. And so Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron. He says, "Go sacrifice your God within the land," meaning inside Egypt. And then we read this, but Moses said, "It is not permissible for us to do so because we will sacrifice to the Lord our God that which is an abomination to the Egyptians. If we kill the animal," remember, sacrifice means to kill the animal for an offering, "which is an abomination to the Egyptians before their eyes, that they can actually see, will they not stone us?" And in a plain sentence, kill us. So you need to understand that the abomination is a deity or an idol. And this idol in the land of Egypt at that point in time is called Kanum. It is a goat or a ram head and a human body. That's what we are seeing. And if the Israelites were to kill an animal that resembles the goat or ram head god, then the Egyptians will think that you are violating their religious emotions, and that's very sensitive. And the Egyptians will kill the Israelites. And so from verse 8 onwards, they are then given instructions how to eat the flesh that night. That night would be the night where you have sunset to sunset. And this is the start of the day. In English, we call it day. Technically, this is night. So on that same night, this is the time for the killing of the animal. This is the time for the eating of the animal. This is the 14th day. This will be the beginning of the 15th day. So that would be how we would be able to understand this. And at this point in time, it was a choice for them. Do you obey God, or are you afraid of the Egyptians trying to kill you? Because you are to put the blood of the animal on the front door. And the blood on the front door will be a sign to show that you have obeyed what God wants. So God's Pesach, God's rules. You roast it in fire. Eat it with matzah. Now in verse 8, you always find that this word is matzah. That's unleavened bread. They make it flat. There's no leaven. It doesn't rise. It's actually baked over the fire. And then you take bitter herbs. Now, bitter herbs are the how would you say, they would give a bitter flavor, and you have to take the flesh plus the matzah. And in this particular instance only, then you would go with bitter herbs. And this would be the instruction. In other places, you would find that matzah would be eaten by itself, but there is no instruction for bitter herbs to be eaten by itself. And so bitter herbs will always be linked to the Passover meal. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled with water. So it needs to be roasted with fire. Both the head, the legs, along with all the innards, everything inside. And the instruction is this: you do not leave any of it over until morning. Where is morning? Morning will be here. So you eat, and then you end the eating. Whatever is left in the morning, you shall completely burn with fire and remove it. Nothing is left to be taken by anybody else. That's the rule. In this first Passover, and for this first Passover only, right? This first Passover, there is another instruction that you eat it this way, with your belt around your waist, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand. Eat it in a hurry. And this is about preparing to leave. And this is only applicable to the first of the Passover, because otherwise they do not have to be attired this way. And then we have the first of the words. It is the Lord's Pesach. Now, the word Pesach actually is a very interesting word. Now, if you're not familiar with the Hebrew, this is what it means actually. It comes from the root word pasak. This would be the verb. This is the noun. And this is to skip over or to hop over. And the picture is this: you get a person, and then you get the person with a stick. So the concept is this: with the stick, and his foot is not well, right? His foot is not well, is crocked, and he has to hop. And this is the idea of hopping, to pasak. In one form of the word, which is a passive form of the word, it does mean lame, right? To be lame in the passive form, It does mean to be lame. But in general, this word pasak as a verb literally means to hop over something. So it's God's hopping over or God's passing over. Now, verse 12 comes that I, and who is I? It is God. God will go through the land of Mizraim on that night. That night would be the night of the 15th. While they are eating, and after they finish eating, God will do something before the morning. And then he says he will fatally strike all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, the human and the animals. This is very important for us to remember. This is to strike the firstborn against the gods of Egypt. God says, I will execute judgment. Ani Jehovah. And so let me highlight the importance. What is the purpose of the Passover? As expressed in verse 12, it is to strike the firstborn. That we know. But the second one, which we seldom read, would be this. It is God against the gods of Egypt. So we have the gods of Egypt. God will execute judgment, punishment. Now, the text in book of Exodus doesn't say exactly what happened to these idols. Now, tradition says that if they were wood, they would decay. If they were metal, they will melt. And all the idols would be discovered to be destroyed on the morning after their firstborn were killed. And so the very important understanding in verse 12 is that the Passover is to strike the firstborn and also to strike against the gods of Egypt. And this will show the power of God over everything powerful in Egypt and will conclude God's presence, that he is the God of Israel and he is the Lord. He is Jehovah. He is the ever living one. And this one we could see in Exodus chapter 3. In verse 13, the blood shall be a sign for you to the houses where you live. Now, what is a sign? A sign is something visible. And so you recall, this would be the doorpost. And then the blood itself is applied to the sides and the lintel. And this is the entrance, the door, the entrance to the house. And then when I, God, see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will come upon you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So this is important, that in verse 13, that God will pass over. Pass over really means to pasak. It is to hop over. It does not mean to be lame. Now, some people try to use this word to show that, God was to be lame at the door. That's not in the Hebrew at all. That is a far-fetched storyline. And so God says that I will pass over, I will hop over you. And what does that mean? Literally, as an image, it will be like this: hop over or pass over. And so, whatever is passed over will be spared, that no plague will come upon you. Verse 14, now this day shall be a memorial to you, and you shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations, you are to celebrate it as a permanent ordinance. This particular memorial in verse 14 means a remembrance. Who is you? The children of Israel. And in chapter 12, the memorial is meaningful to them because they are leaving Egypt. And they're leaving Egypt by a very specific ritual called the Passover. And God wants them to make this the first of the months to celebrate, to remember, right? As a permanent ordinance. A permanent ordinance is quite an interesting thing. Um, I think we could say that this would be an ordinance, and this word permanent is olam. It is usually translated as forever, but a better way to translate it is for a long time. And so God expects them to celebrate and remember this event as long as they are able to remember them. Verse 15, for 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, matzah, but on the first day you shall remove dough with yeast from your houses. Now, this idea of yeast or the leavening is an important concept. The idea of leaven here is saor, to remove leaven. This is the yeast or leaven. And to remove that there is no leaven in the houses during this time. And so what do you do is that you have to remove it before the unleavened bread festival comes, or the 7 days, right? Before the 7 days come, that the dough with yeast has to be removed. So all dough, everything made with leaven, as a ritual cleansing, no leaven. And so remember, God's feasts, God's rules. So nobody is there to say, why like that, right? You just have to do it. And so it says, for whoever eats anything with yeast from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be karat, cut off from Israel. Verse 15. Now, the idea of karat is to be removed from memory. That would be a good way of explaining it. Now, there is some rules. On the first day, you shall have a holy assembly. You gather together, and then the holy assembly on the 7th day. So you have the first day and the 7th day. No work shall be done on them, except for what must be eaten by every person. That alone may be prepared by you. So what does it mean? We have a situation where you can prepare food to survive, which is fine. But then no work shall be done on them. And this no work literally means no work. No work by or for the children of Israel. And what this means is that if there is a non-Israelite, they can do whatever they want. But what is important here would be the non-Israelite cannot do any work for the Israelite. There is no bypassing this rule. When it says that they are not supposed to work, they are not supposed to work, not even with something else or somebody else. And the idea of removing all the yeast or the leaven is for them to realize that the leaven is an idea of power, right? Of strength. And when it's added to dough, it will cause it to rise and it becomes bread. If you don't use leaven, it becomes unleavened and it's flat and it has no strength or no power. I think one of the significance is for the Israelites to realize that leaving Egypt has nothing to do with them. So you can have food to eat called unleavened. And when you leave Egypt, you realize that it is by the power of God. I think that would be a very interesting way of looking at the idea of leaven. Verse 17, you shall also keep the feast of unleavened bread, for on this day I brought your multitudes out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall keep this day throughout your generations as an ordinance, olam, for a long time, right? Long time. Then it says here, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. So always remember that the days will begin from evening to evening to evening. And so this is where the day ends. And so they eat it from evening to evening. Before the evening of the next day comes, that would be the 21st day, and that would be ending. In verse 19, he continues, for 7 days there shall be no dough with yeast. So no yeast at all, no leaven found in your houses. Whoever eats that yeast, the person will be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether stranger or native of the land. Now, what does that mean? It means this, in this particular case, you see, work. Children of Israel cannot do, not even by other people doing it for them. No can do. Leaven, all cannot eat. But the non-Israelite, they can work, but they cannot do work for the Israelite. So you can see that these are some of the details that it's here, right? So all cannot eat, whether stranger or native. That if you're not an Israelite, you are also obligated because you're staying in Israel. You shall not eat anything with yeast. In all your dwellings, you shall eat unleavened bread. That's matzah. And this is unleavened bread without the Passover, what do you call it, young ram or kid or a baby goat. Verse 21. Now, when it comes to verse 21, you see a little repeat. This time it is Moses and Aaron speaking to the congregation. God's instruction is over up to verse 20. Now, how did Moses relate all this? So, and then after God spoke, it's Moses' turn. Moses called the elders of the Israel and said to them. So, what does this usually mean? In the congregation concept, you find that Moses and Aaron would speak to the elders who represent the congregation and then to the rest. So, elders are a small group and they represent the heads of tribes. And the rest would be all the tribal people. And it would be relayed from elder to the rest. And what did Moses and Aaron said to them? Says, go take for yourselves, remember, se, according to your families, slaughter or kill the Passover. Now in verse 21, it says, kill the Pasach, kill the idea of kill the Pasach or kill the Pesach, this would be the sacrifice animal. Remember, the animal would have to be unblemished, male, less than 1 year, and then from sheep or goat. All of these. And make sure you have it for the 4 days from the 10th to the 14th. And then you shall take a bunch of hyssop. Now, the word hyssop is actually Greek. That is not Hebrew. Hebrew is etsof. And in the Greek, it's translated as hyssop. And so you use this hyssop like a grass type and dip it in the blood, which is in the basin. Apply some of the blood in the basin to the lintel and the 2 doorposts, and none of you shall go outside of his house until morning. And so this is important. Stay home. Things are going to happen outside. You don't want to be out there. And outside will be frightening. And so the instruction is to stay home. So we have 2 things, right? The attire with the attitude of ready to run, and to be at home, safe at home. Verse 23. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. Now, this idea of verse 23, pass through, is to move from end to end of the land and to punish, to strike the Egyptians when he, who is he? The Lord. He will see the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts. This is important. The Lord will pass over the door. Remember this word, pass over, is to skip over, hop over. Remember, there is a passive word that I mentioned. In the passive word, it's to be lame. And this is not the word here. It is not to say the Lord will be lame at the door, right? The word here is the Lord will pass over the door. And continuing on, he will not allow, he will not give permission And so God is the one who says, okay, not okay. So God is the judge. He gives the judgment. And then the destroyer, likely an angel, he will not be coming into your houses to strike you for the firstborn. And you shall keep this event as an ordinance for you and your children. And in verse 24, it says, Olam again, right? Olam, for a long time. Keep, just like the idea um, in verse 24, to guard, to protect, to always remember. This event, first of the month, the Passover, leaving Egypt. And remember what is this means? Every year at this springtime, the first month. Verse 25. Verse 25 would then tell them um, that when they come into the land which the Lord will give them, as he has promised. Now, this word here in verse 25, as he has promised, as he has spoken. Now, who has he spoken this to? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You shall keep this right. You shall keep this. And this idea here is the service, the work of the Passover. Remember God's Passover, God's rules. Every year they are to do this. Verse 26. When your children say to you, what does this rite mean? What does this service mean to you? And so you recall, the father is to tell the children, and the children tells it to the children's children, and so on and so on. In our last two verses for today, then you shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice. It means that this is Zevach Pesach. This is the Hebrew word, the Passover sacrifice. And you remember this ritual for leaving Egypt and for God to judge the gods of Egypt. And this is done to God because he passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians but spared our homes. The reaction after the people heard this is important. The people bowed low and worshiped, which is not in the text. So the first word here is to bow down, right? To bow down. In a way, to bend the body. The second word here is not worship, but literally to be in prostrate position. Both of this, an A and a B, is to demonstrate humility. They know what God is doing. They know what God told them, and they've heard it from Moses. And so the sons of Israel went and did what they were told. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. This was a choice to obey. And in this choice to obey, God will judge. Two peoples. God will judge the Israelites, who they would fear, whether God or the Egyptians. God will judge the gods of Egypt. And this event at the beginning of spring would be a remembrance for a long time to come. And so, with this, we come to the end of our first segment with regards to the Passover sacrifice, Zeva'ak Pesach.